What does a weapon look like when it's built for a world that no longer exists? In 1959, military planners on both sides of the Iron Curtain were solving the same problem. Not how to fight the next war, how to survive it. The bombs were already built. The missiles were already pointed. NATO's own strategic doctrine required nuclear weapons to be available from the first hour of any conflict. Soviet planners had accepted the same reality. The next war would begin with fire from the sky, and then the armies would still have to fight. In Leningrad, in the design bureaus of the Kirov plant, a team of engineers led by L.S. Troyanov had been working since 1955 on an answer to that problem. This is what they built. In 1960, after 5 years of development, after trials, after one complete running prototype had proved the concept, the man who ran the Soviet Union saw it and canceled it with a rule that made it mathematically impossible to exist. One survived. Nobody has ever fully explained why. (1959) Both superpowers had hydrogen bombs. Both had intercontinental missiles. Both had spent the decades since Hiroshima rethinking what war actually meant. NATO's strategic doctrine, still in force in 1959, was explicit. Nuclear weapons would be available from the outset of hostilities, not held in reserve, not used as a last resort, available from the first hour. The Soviet side had reached the same conclusion from the opposite direction. Declassified American intelligence from the period assessed that Moscow already possessed nuclear weapons suitable not just for strategic delivery, but for tactical use, on the battlefield, against troops, against armor. The Soviet military did not respond to this by abandoning ground warfare. They responded by planning to win ground warfare after nuclear use had already begun. Their doctrine was precise. After nuclear weapons were used, the armies would still advance, still exploit breakthroughs, still take territory. The goal was not to survive the apocalypse. The goal was to win the war that came after it. That doctrine had one catastrophic problem. A standard tank of 1959, even a good one, was built for conventional war. A nuclear shockwave catches it broadside and flips it. Radiation penetrates the crew compartment. The tracks sink into the irradiated soft ground, churned up by blast craters. The crew dies. The tank becomes a tomb. Every tank that existed in 1959 shared this problem. They were magnificent machines for a war that was already obsolete. The Soviet engineers knew this. So in 1955, with a formal Council of Ministers decree, they started again from zero. The question they were answering was simple, and it was the most serious question anyone had ever asked of a tank designer. What does a tank look like when it has to fight after the bombs have already fallen? This is what they built. Officially designated Object 279, 60 tons, 1,000 horsepower, a 130mm gun capable of destroying any tank on the 1959 battlefield, armor up to 305mm thick on the turret, and a shape that no one had ever put on a tank before. The hull was not designed to look like a flying saucer. It was designed to deflect. Cast from 4 massive curved steel sections, a semi-spherical cross-section that sent blast waves, shaped charges, and armor-piercing rounds sliding around and away rather than through. The outer skirt running around the hull's perimeter added another layer, a permanent screen that further disrupted incoming shaped charges before they could reach the main armor. The armor package alone weighed 32 tons, more than an entire modern infantry fighting vehicle. But armor is nothing without mobility, and here Object 279 did something no 60-ton tank had ever done. 4 tracks instead of 2, spread wide across the hull, distributing 60 tons across 4 contact patches, driving ground pressure down to roughly 0.6 kilograms per square centimeter. That is the ground pressure of the PT-76, a light tank, an amphibious scout vehicle weighing less than 15 tons. Object 279 crossed terrain that should have swallowed it. During trials, it crossed a peat bog 1.5 meters deep, and then towed another stuck tank out behind it. A 60-ton machine, moving where 60-ton machines were not supposed to move. This was what made it genuinely revolutionary. Not a single feature, but the combination. A 60-ton heavy tank that could cross the obstacle-choked, crater-torn ground of a post-nuclear battlefield, with a gun that could kill anything it met, and armor that could take anything that came back. No other tank in 1959 put that whole package together in one running prototype. The popular claim, repeated across military history channels and military games, is that Object 279 was specifically built to survive the shockwave of a nearby nuclear explosion, that it was an anti-nuclear tank in the most literal sense. In 2025, a researcher from the institute that built it was asked directly. He said no specialized anti-blast equipment had been installed. What Object 279 had was genuine NBC protection, overpressure systems, contamination sealing, crew protection from the battlefield environment. Real measures. But a bespoke nuclear blast survival machine? Disputed. Not proven in any accessible original Soviet requirement. The myth was bigger than the machine. The machine was still extraordinary. December 24th, 1959. The first prototype begins factory trials. May 1960. Factory testing complete. The running prototype performs. July 22nd, 1960. Nikita Khrushchev arrives at Kapustin Yar. He reviews the latest Soviet military hardware. He sees the heavy tanks. What he said, exactly, is not recorded in any public document. What followed his visit is documented. A 37-ton limit. All tracked vehicles heavier than 37 tons forbidden from development. By late November 1960, the Kirov plant had been formally informed. By February 1961, the decree was finalized. The heavy tank program, Objects 277, 278, 279, 770, all of them, dead. Here is why this explanation fails as a complete answer. The armor alone weighed 32 tons. 32 tons? Out of a 60-ton vehicle. Khrushchev's rule said the entire tank could weigh 37. To comply, you would need to remove more than 20 tons from a machine whose protection package already consumed 32. You would need to remove armor from a tank whose entire purpose was its armor. That is not modification. That is conceptual destruction. Khrushchev didn't cancel the tank. He canceled the idea of the tank. The 37-ton rule was real, but it was a tool, not a reason. Declassified American intelligence from the period gives us the fuller picture. Khrushchev's January 1960 reorganization put main reliance on nuclear missile forces, cut manpower, accelerated retirement of older weapon categories, freed resources for the civilian economy. His argument, made publicly and repeatedly, science and technology now made it possible to maintain security with smaller expenditure of resources. Missiles were cheaper than tank armies. Missiles required fewer men. Missiles did not need 5 years of expensive development to produce a single 60-ton prototype with a maintainability problem. In that frame, Object 279 was almost the perfect anti-Khrushchev machine. Complex, expensive, category-defining. Tied to a doctrine of heavy armored breakthrough that missiles were supposed to have made obsolete. But here's what the explanation still cannot account for. The Soviet Union spent 5 years building this machine. Multiple design bureaus competed. Objects 277, 278, 279, and 770 were all developed simultaneously. Enormous resources, serious engineering. This was not an idle experiment. This was a state commitment. And then, in the window between Khrushchev seeing it in July 1960 and the formal cancellation decree in February 1961, it ended. Soviet doctrine still required large armored theater forces. Soviet planners still believed armies would fight and advance after nuclear use. That doctrine did not die with Object 279. It continued for decades. So why did the machine built for that doctrine die? The honest answer is that we don't fully know. The original files from the Kirov plant and the Military Procurement Office have not been publicly opened. Khrushchev's exact words at Kapustin Yar are not recorded. The gap between the official reason and the real one is still there. One prototype survived. Not by design, by the triage of cancellation. The surviving running vehicle transferred to the proving ground, then eventually to the collection at Kubinka. In 2022, 62 years after cancellation, the sole surviving Object 279 was restored to running condition in the Kubinka workshops. Everything Khrushchev used to justify the cancellation was reconsidered. Everything except the cancellation itself. L.S. Troyanov, the designer of Object 279, continued working. Department head through the 1960s. Senior researcher at the Institute afterward. His career did not end with the tank. Whether he ever explained, in writing, what he thought of the cancellation, the record does not say. The files from the Kirov plant remain archived. The original trial reports have not been publicly released. Khrushchev is dead. The Soviet Union is gone. The doctrine that built Object 279 was buried with both of them. The tank is still here, running. Nobody ever explained why he stopped it.